The fourth quadrant of the mandala, and then I will open it up for questions, of which I hope there are many, is feminism. And I feel very trepidatious wading into this. But nevertheless, I really feel in some ways it is the most important of all of these, because it is going to work the change that is going to go on between us as individuals. What is happening, I think, is nothing less than an awareness that the most appropriate way to talk about the entelechy of this planet is to call it her, and to admit that the goddess worship which was repressed by the rise of the patriarchal religions is now, its return is necessary. I don't want to say that the patriarchal interlude, which lasted to 3,000 years, was not necessary. I think it was necessary. But the fear will go out of the bomb. Psychedelics I count as a feminizing force because they introduce you to the unconscious. Cybernetics I count as a feminizing force because it hardwires that same unconsciousness and raises it into inaccessibility. No longer are these things the theoretical constructs of psychologists. They become, living realities in our lives. And the transformation of the species into a spacefaring, whether interior, exterior, or something else kind of space, is only going to happen if this feminizing influence can now take the heat off the technological processes which were necessary to move us here. And feminism really, it has nothing to do with gender. It's just an attitude toward being in the world that is open, I think, basically to the translinguistic. If you had to strip it of all biological notions of what feminism is a kind of mentality which operates exterior to language. And there's no, it's like the Nagual and the Tonal, there's no unifying those two things or encompassing one with the other. It just is not like that. These things are alchemical opposites. And as such, the only way they can be unified is in a kind of coincidentia oppositorum, a union of opposites where the identity of each element is still fully expressed. This is not a rational concept. It's like being in two places at one time. Nevertheless, it is a concept that is psychologically and experientially very, very valuable. And I see, as I say, all of these forms of self-exploration and technological expansion, and even space. I mean, if the Earth is our mother, then certainly outer space is our dark blue great-grandmother. So I sort of give this as a background on what was said this morning, because I wanted to convey the one thing I have to convey which is uniquely mine, which is this strange wave. And that's mine, but it's difficult to understand, and its importance is open to debate. It may be trivial in the extreme. This afternoon, I sort of wanted to speak as a member of the culture who is trying to figure it out like everybody else, using the same data banks that everybody else is using. And it was in Hawaii that I thought about this a lot, and I think these are the four pillars or the four quadrants of the mandala that lead in to the coincidentia oppositorum, which is the flying saucer, the exteriorized soul of the human race at the end of time, the transcendent object that will carry us all completely out of these concerns and into an entirely different set of concerns of which we have not the faintest inkling. So are there questions or debate? In the back, Dawn.
Did you know that I've read literature that high doses of psilocybin allow people to understand
Oh yes, there's a wonderful story, a Gordon Wasson story, where he took I think 12 grams, or anyway, a lot in Oaxaca up on a mountain, and he sang all night long in just this exultant, ecstatic singing. And when he came down to the village the next morning, the people said, "We didn't know you spoke Mazatecan. You sing beautifully." I had an experience which reflects on this, which is in 75, when we first wrote the mushroom book, and we were really doing it a lot because we had a lot of batch testing to do and that kind of thing. It would get into these poetic dialogues where it would just be spieling off its vision of things. But at the end of each of these sentences, it would say, says, blah, 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 says, and again, and I thought, strange speech habit. And then I read in Wasson that the word sin occurs at the end of these speech utterances of Maria Sabina's, and that it is the Mazatec word for says. So it's just like, the mushroom is uncanny. Drugs, models of what drugs do, will not encompass it. That's why the extraterrestrial thing is so compelling. And I don't know whether the mushroom is a radio or the extraterrestrial itself. When I said this morning that if you understand the DNA as a species, you will take control of your form, I always have the notion that the mushroom has done this, and that's why it touches matter so very lightly. I mean, the mushroom is a very thinly spread mycelial network through a field or a meadow somewhere. The carpophore, what we call the mushroom, is an appurtenance to the sexual process. As Ralph Abraham said one time, it's for sex, thrills, and sunbathing. And that's all it's for. The mushroom is perfectly able to propagate itself by vegetatively growing through the soil. But the mushroom, if we believe it is an entity, it lives in its own imagination. It has gotten so rid of a physical form that all it is a little bit of white stuff in the soil and a raging trip in an unknown dimension, which you can only slice into by allowing it to translocate into your nervous system. And then it continues to give off its experience of itself, which is an immersion in pure imagination, For it, the thought is the fact of the matter. It's as though the mushroom were made of pure light. If you think about what it would be like to be made of light, light moves at relativistic speeds. Therefore, if a photon has no perception of time, if a photon could think and thought, I am now going to cross the galaxy, and then did cross the galaxy, the photon's perception of how long that took would be zero. The photon is a particle which in the physics we know has the experience as though it were the imagination. And I think that this inner-outer space that we keep talking about, that we're headed into, is like the inner-outer space of the mushroom. These things can be found to be contiguous and somehow two aspects of the same thing, arising out of a misperception having to do with edges, that we're very interested in the inside and the outside, the surface of my body and the interior of my body, but these inside-outside distinctions are preposterous, obviously. Infinite space is infinite space, and then we're only quibbling about how it's experienced by whether you send a thought or an instrumentated probe obeying Newtonian ballistics.
Have you thought possibly of running a program next to the historical calendrical one you have there of, say, the advent of tea in English society and the advent of coffee in, say, American society, and the relationships, let's say, between Arab societies, which are heavy coffee drinkers, and
you mean to try and track the drug effect?
Yes, because obviously every society is bound together by a network of drugs. I mentioned the other day that the change that's taken place in the United States with the program to stop people from smoking cigarettes, tobacco being a leveler, and then the rise in stress after that, and then the whole industry built upon stress. There's obviously a relationship between the drugs used in a society.
That's right.
And what the society does.
Well, we were talking last night. My brother wants to say, and is in fact publicly lectured to this point, that the missing link in the question of how did humanness emerge so quickly. You know, there was basically a hominoid form, a human-like form 3 million years ago. But really, it's in the last 50,000 years that the human brain size has undergone this immense expansion. The human brain has grown more in the last 50,000 years than in the previous 3 million years. And he wants to suggest that the catalyst for that was actually that when Africa turned drier and people started living on the ground and hunting in packs, they encountered herds of ungulate animals, and they would track them for days. And this tracking of herds of animals brings you through a lot of their manure naturally. And so they would have noticed this very anomalous object in the world of natural objects, which is the mushroom. It's very large, it's very noticeable, and they would have eaten it. And this would have conferred a sufficient adaptive advantage, the expansion of consciousness, that they would have, it would have been sufficient to prime the pump to develop consciousness. I talked to Roland Fisher years ago about some of these ideas. He did experiments, very interesting experiments at NIMH, in which they could they had 2 parallel metal bars, and they could, by turning a screw, deform one of the bars slightly so they were no longer parallel to each other. And they would take straight people and people who had been given small doses of psilocybin, and they would sit them down in front of this thing, and they would say, push the buzzer when the bars are no longer parallel. And they discovered that people on small doses of psilocybin could pick this up much sooner than normal people. And so Rollins' conclusion, he said, there, you see, here's perfect proof, scientific proof, that taking drugs gives you a truer picture of the world. Well, it's a joke, of course, but if we're talking about hunters hurling spears and trailing after animals, a 5% increase in visual acuity is a staggering adaptive advantage. And that's just one of the most trivial effects of the mushroom, is this improvement of visual acuity. What it does for language is totally unexplored. What it does for memory, what it does for all kinds of things is unexplored. If we, before they were called psychedelics, before they were called all the things, entheogens and all these things, they were simply given a phenomenological description, consciousness expanding drugs. Well, if you take that seriously, consciousness is what it's all about. Consciousness is what we certainly need. It's what we're in short supply of. We are not going to weather the cultural crises that are bearing down on this planet without a great deal of consciousness being generated. So if there is any agent in the environment, drug, teaching, practice, you name it, that actually increases consciousness, it is going to loom very important. In my experience, hallucinogenic drugs are pretty much unique in the power and the efficacy that they bring to the process of promoting consciousness. Yeah, over here, was there somebody? No? Yeah, go ahead. Well, my experience of it is not that it's no sweat. It's the most terrifying thing I do in my life.
But you do it, But you're generalizing about a lot of kinds of drugs, it sounds like to me, because like street kids don't get many mushrooms. They get more
Chemicals.
I which are not yeah.
But I think you have a valid point in that the problem in our society is that we have no shamanic tradition, no schedule of initiation. We don't know whether our kids should take these drugs at 14 or 8 and this is a real problem. I've often, if in a archaic society, it's all laid out for you. The elders understand. They bring you into it. There's ritual. There's initiation. It's amazing that we're all here, some of the things we've been through. I mean, I've made the analogy to a person walking, that a psychedelic drug is like the situation of a person walking along the beach, and they come upon a beautiful sailboat, and they know nothing about sailing. Well, what are the odds that they will be able to enjoy the thrill of sailing if they have no teacher? And I don't mean I'm loath to buy into the notion that one human being has anything to teach another, except things like close your eyes, be quiet, turn off the music. These are teachings of great importance. Right.
I think that there's a part in there too where we've got hold of the wrong end of the stick. I don't think that consciousness can be expanded. I think it's always at its maximum, and that there are inhibitors around by, let's say, habit, and that these inhibitors can be released by drugs or can be accentuated. Obviously, tobacco is an accentuator of the inhibitor because it levels things out, and there are other drugs which will release the inhibitor so that consciousness seems to be more, but it really isn't. One has just released inhibitors. Does that make any sense?
Well, yeah, but I want to make sure who gets inhibited.
Yeah, but you see, yes. But now you see, now it's random. You see,
right.
It's random.
Well, the mushroom is such a special case, It certainly draws your attention to an unusual part of reality if it's there all the time. The fact that it seems to be a communicator is puzzling. I still haven't made up my mind about it. When people ask me how I choose drugs, I started out a radical. Nobody else was talking about drugs. Now I find I'm the anchor dragging the ship because I say it should be a plant, number one. It should have a history of shamanic usage, number two. It should have a similarity to brain chemistry. And I am extremely unenthusiastic about MDMA and all these things. It's a plant with a history of shamanic usage. I always say, if you can get 2 out of the 3, let's go do it. Sure.
What turns you off?
It's simply that at 4 times the effective dose, it's approaching being toxic. It has. There's this notion called the LD50. Which is how much of a drug you have to give to 20 mice to kill 10 of them. In other words, 50% of the sample dies, right? The LD50 for MDMA is too close to the effective dose. Absolutely, absolutely. You see, LSD is the safest drug in terms of physical. We're always speaking here of pure chemicals, not street stuff, because no one has ever figured out the LD50 of LSD. you can take 5,000 times the effective dose, and after 16 hours you just shake your head and walk away from it. Psilocybin, the LD50, is 275 times the effective dose.
What happens when you OD?
You have heart failure. You die of an acute coronary thrombosis. This is not to put down MDMA. Most drugs are toxic. What?
Sounds like what you talked about BDA for MDMA. You've got a really interesting thing going on. At least you can ask him after.
Well, anyway, my point is that these shamanic drugs that are hallowed by millennia of usage are much safer. The other thing about them is that they're the strongest psychedelics that exist. This is the great paradox. The safest drugs are the strongest. All it requires is courage. Courage which I do not have all the time, and in fact quite rarely for the biggies. And that's very interesting. I've said many times, the problem is not to, with regard to psychedelics, the problem is not to find the answer. The problem is to face the answer. We've got the answer. Sasha doesn't have to do another thing. We've got the answer. The question now is, do you have the guts to do it?